right, let's continue this discussion around the use of social media in these historic elections in Zimbabwe. We're joined now in studio by Tebogo Titsejo. He's a social media analyst. Thanks very much for coming into studio. Some interesting things being said around Nelson Chamisa, particularly his use of social media with regard to these elections. You've been keeping a hawk's eye, as you told me, off air on social media and Zimbabwe's elections. What are you gathering?
Well, I think it's very exciting times for our neighbors in Zimbabwe, and you can see on social media that the whole world is interested. All the continents in the world and most of the countries have been tweeting about Zimbabwe, particularly when we put the word Zimbabwe in our search in the programs that we're using. And it shows that, there's a general interest, in how the elections are going to be managed. As you've noticed that in previous times, the legitimacy of the elections in Zimbabwe have been called into question. And we've had a historical issue in Africa with liberation movements that are very reluctant to hand over power. And you ask yourself, how can you liberate people and refuse to let go of power? Because the liberation is to free the people. And it was about the people and not necessarily about the particular movements. So everybody is watching, you have, independent observers on the ground. But the question is, will that be enough to deliver free and fair elections?
So the official opposition, Nelson Chamisa, he's been very vocal on social media. He's already declared that the MDC alliance has won the elections. In terms of how people are seeing these elections unfold, what are you seeing in terms of what people are tweeting? Are they declaring their alliance either way?
Well, you find on social media, and I think it's very impressive how the youth of Zimbabwe particularly have been expressing themselves freely about who they support, why they support, who they support, and responses to what has been happening. Like when the former president, Robert Mugabe, went to do his press conference, a lot of people were encouraging him and speaking about that, highly in an admirable fashion, which is very ironic.
And these are young people, from what you can gather.
And these are young people. You'll find a lot of times people, will be very positive towards someone who has gone through a difficult time. So you'll find that it is nostalgia, and they perhaps may have forgotten, how the history of Zimbabwe has been, under his leadership. But I think also, if you look at, the specific developments, everybody has been free to express themselves and, forming their alliances. But I think for the most part, it has been neutral and positive, towards Zimbabwe because it has been relatively peaceful.
So you're saying that people aren't necessarily declaring their alliance towards the MDC and Nelson Chamisa versus Emmerson Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF?
Well, before the voting took place, you found a lot of the discussion was more about whether or not it would be peaceful and whether or not people will be allowed to be free and fair when they cast their ballots. But after it took place, you found people, speculating about who's going to win. A lot of people, because they saw some of the results trickling in, were talking about whether or not it's going to the MDC or it's going to the ZANU-PF.
So there's a lot of talk around the legitimacy of these elections, given the history of Zimbabwe and elections. What are you hearing on that front? Are people optimistic that, given the amount of eyes on these elections, that they will be credible, free and fair?
No. The optimism with regards to the results of the elections is very low. A lot of people are very pessimistic, especially with regards to the rural votes. In the urban areas, I think the optimism is quite high, where they do believe that, in Harare and Bulawayo, the results will be relatively credible. But when it comes to the rural areas, there are conspiracy theories being flown around that the delay in releasing the results is because the results are being cooked. And I think that the speculation could be as a result of a bit of a missing communication from the Zimbabwean Electoral Commission, where they've allowed there to be space, for speculation. They need to close that space down and clearly communicate what are the next steps in the process.
I want to just be clear on the number of people you are monitoring on Twitter, just so we have perspective on what we're discussing. I mean, it's 5.5, 5.6 million registered voters. Yeah. How many people are tweeting, as far as you can see?
Well, currently we can see the impressions. So that is the amount of people who have been reached by the word Zimbabwe. and that is sitting at 33 million. You know, it's jumped, you know, from yesterday at 16 to 33 million currently. And in terms of the sentiment, 17% is negative and 37% is positive. So it does show you that the general response on social media has been positive. And it is very encouraging, you know, to see, you know, that democracy is seen to be in place, but hopefully the intentions of this is not necessarily to just rubber stamp, you know, the incumbent, but rather to listen to the voices of the people of Zimbabwe and to respect the processes.